Hey everyone, thank you for joining today. Today we're going to be doing something slightly different than normal. We're going to be reacting to an audio-only podcast by, it was a conversation between Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris. And if you just a little bit about me really quick, I am a tech entrepreneur. I created a venture-backed company in the crypto space, and I've been reacting to lots of different videos on a variety of interesting topics. And my focus is on intellectually stimulating conversations at the intersection of technology and society. And so I really think that technology is an important part of our world, and I am interested in exploring the implications for how this changes the way that we should operate in the world and the types of decisions that we should make. And I thought this was a really interesting conversation. It was commonly thought of as a train wreck. People think this is one of the worst podcast episodes ever, and it was just basically a complete instance of two people talking past each other and finding no common ground and not budging. And people think it was a very unproductive conversation. I, on the other hand, thought it was very interesting, and it really pushed. Specifically, it pushed Jordan Peterson to expand deeper on his perspective, which Sam Harris didn't appreciate, but I think it really brings to light a lot of really interesting core issues. One thing I've been talking about recently on this channel is artificial intelligence. And a lot of people are worried about the existential risk that is introduced when we have more and more powerful artificial intelligence. I think anyone watching this can look at the news and see what's available now today on ChatGPT and all of that, and they can see AI is getting a lot better. And as it gets better and better, the voices that oppose AI are going to get louder and louder. They're going to be more and more concerned about what will happen as AI gains in capability. And so there are a lot of people out there who are formulating arguments for why we should be concerned about AI and why we should pause its development, or why we should ban AI and ban even large data centers and implement a variety of different policies. So as this is becoming central, we need to basically study these arguments and decide what if we agree with them. I personally am very skeptical that we need to do this. But one thing that I think is very important about this discussion about whether AI is risky or not is it comes down to an understanding of evolution. And I think in this episode, Jordan Peterson puts forth an evolutionary theory about truth, which is very interesting. And I think that this is a really good starting point for people to start thinking about things through an evolutionary lens. And basically with this toolkit that we're going to start assembling in this video, we're going to get a deeper understanding of how Darwinism shapes the world and how these ideas can be applied outside of traditional biological contexts. One of the things at some point I want to bring this back around to is this discussion around AI and what AI will do, and does it pose an existential risk, and so on. But that will be far outside the scope of this video. I think what I want to do here is just really explore the philosophy that's being discussed in this video and go back to this iconic conversation. I mean, this was at the time when the intellectual dark web was emerging. It was an exciting time, and these people were coming on the scene and really becoming stars. And so this is a really cool historic conversation, and I think there's a lot to learn from what these two have to say. So give me 1 second while I realized that I mistakenly deleted the source for this video. So I'm going to have to re-add the source to the live stream before you can hear the audio from this podcast episode. So bear with me for 1 second. I'm just finding the Google Chrome tab. All right. Okay. I'm going to make this way smaller. Okay. So I'm going to just start playing this, and we will listen to what they have to say and react. And just for context, and for those who don't know who Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson are, Sam Harris is an atheist. He has his own moral philosophy that he's developed out of, I guess you could call it rationality. I think this is also an interesting area that we can explore further. I think that a lot of his stuff breaks down upon further scrutiny. And then Jordan Peterson is a psychologist who advocates for a specific view of Christianity. Again, some of these things are highly debatable, but I do generally like a lot of the ideas that he has, because they seem to be rooted in ancient wisdom in a way that I think is wise and interesting, regardless of whether the theological elements of it are sound. So anyway, let's start listening to this conversation.
Welcome to the Waking Up Podcast. This is Sam Harris. Okay, well, today, back by popular demand, I have Jordan Peterson. Jordan is a clinical psychologist and professor at the University of Toronto. He formerly taught at Harvard University, and he has published articles on drug abuse and alcoholism and aggression, but he has made a special focus on tyranny, and of late he has been fighting a pitched battle against political correctness up in Canada, and he's attracted a lot of support and criticism on that front. As I said last time around, he is far and away the most requested guest I've ever had. And we did a podcast about 4 or so episodes back entitled What is True? Podcast number 6.
Okay, I'm on the wrong one, actually. It's this one here. What is true? Sorry, guys. And just so you know, I have a playlist called Sources on my channel. So everything that I read, all the major videos that I react to, I added this channel.
Welcome to the Waking Up Podcast. This is Sam Harris. Well, today I am speaking with a guest who many of you may not have heard of. He is a clinical psychologist at the University of Toronto by the name of Jordan Peterson, who has become quite famous online recently for standing in opposition to changes to the Human Rights Code in Ontario, Canada, that have really direct relevance to him as a professor. And he's been on many different podcasts, Joe Rogan, Dave Rubin, GadSad, I think. So, many people who you may also listen to have interviewed him. And he is actually, as I say at the beginning of this interview, the most requested guest I have had at this point by all of you. I can't tell you how many people have emailed me or tweeted at me demanding that I have Jordan on the podcast. And it's really in anticipation of us not talking about free speech, but about his beliefs about religion and its importance, the connection between religious truth and scientific truth, the importance of mythology. All of this is stuff that has come out in his other interviews, which many atheists and secularists have found both perplexing and inspiring. I've seen many atheists say that this, Jordan is giving the first construal of religion that I find hard to grapple with, that is interesting, that seems morally important and intellectually honest. So many, many of you have wanted to get the two of us together so that we could presumably butt heads on these topics. So I did invite Jordan on the podcast, and you are about to hear that conversation. And I am, as I say at the end, going to rely on all of you to figure out what happened. Because from my point of view, we got bogged down on a very narrow point of more than just philosophical interest. We got bogged down on what it means to say that something is true or not. And to my eye, we didn't take that analysis very far because we immediately hit rather significant impediment and difference of opinion about what is entailed there. And I just couldn't get Jordan to agree on some facts that seem so basic to me that I was uncomfortable moving forward on other topics until we ironed that out. And it took more than 2 hours to get to a point where I thought, well, this is a good stopping point. We will see whether, based on the public reception to this, whether it is useful to move on to talk about morality and myth and religion and all the rest. I wanted to be my best self for the rest of that conversation, and I was running out of energy and patience there, so I decided to pull the brakes. But you now have 2 hours of me and Jordan butting heads on a variety of topics related to scientific epistemology, for lack of a better word. Please judge for yourselves how we did and what was going on there. It's not absolutely clear to me what we disagree about, but you'll hear me attempt to push really as hard as I could to get some answers there, and I really don't feel that I got them. So the fault could absolutely be mine, and I will rely on you to inform me of that. So I don't know where this is best done, perhaps on Reddit, but somebody bring my attention to what gets said here, if anything useful gets said in response to this podcast. These are all experiments in conversation. Now I bring you another one. Please enjoy my conversation with Jordan Peterson. I am here with Jordan Peterson. Jordan, thanks for coming on the podcast.
My pleasure. Thanks for the invitation.
Well, listen, you have the distinction of being, I think, without question, the person who my listeners most requested that I talk to. So congratulations. People really want to hear what you have to say.
Yeah, well, I think they want to hear what we both have to say. So, and hopefully we can manage that in a way that works out real well. That would be good as far as I'm concerned.
Actually, I'm very hopeful we'll have an interesting conversation here. I think, you seem to suddenly be everywhere on the internet, and you've been on many other podcasts, and I think we should talk briefly about the reasons why you've suddenly become so visible, but I don't think we should spend a lot of time on them, because I think that's territory where you and I will almost fully converge, and I think that's not what people are most interested in having us talk about. But to just get people up to speed with what's been happening with you and why you've been so visible all of a sudden, let's talk briefly about the free speech issues, the gender pronoun issues, what's happening in Canada around this bill C-16 and the gender provision in the Ontario Human Rights Code. Just bring us up to speed there. And I think we should spend probably no more than 10 minutes or so there, and then we'll move on to areas where you and I may not fully agree.
10 minutes would be plenty, yeah. Canada moved at the federal level to institute some legislation that on the surface of it seems more or less in keeping with the extension of human rights protection to different groups that's been occurring, say, over the last 30 to 50 years. This time.
Just pausing it here. That was a bit of a long lead in, but as you can see, there was a lot of frustration that Sam Harris was kind of preemptively voicing before letting us hear the recording. And he seemed to be, it was interesting that he was saying he ran out of energy and was frustrated. I don't mean to psychoanalyze him, but there does seem to be some extent to which he lacks a certain level of curiosity and maybe is just doesn't. He just seems like he seems less interested in kind of like playing with ideas and exploring if Jordan Peterson is saying something so weird, why is that? He's a very popular person. He's clearly very intelligent. So what does he really have? What is he trying to say here? Like, what kind of, can I get him to say something absurd? How can I steer this conversation? And I think you might see what I'm talking about a little bit later on in this interview, but I do get these kind of hints of basically getting frustrated at a lack of agreement rather than seeing that as an opportunity to explore ideas further. Just kind of like a little comment that I thought as we were re-listening to that. But now we're going to hear a bit about Jordan Peterson's background in Canadian politics and all the controversy with that. I hope they get through that pretty quickly, because that's not really that relevant anymore, I don't think, and it's also not that interesting. Anyway, let's keep listening.
And they extend.
Also, on my streams, I try to play things at 1x speed, so that it's always something that you can do 2x when you're listening to it on playback. So I waste my own time so that you don't have to keep adjusting the speed, because if I'm playing it at 2x and then you do 2x, it'll get too fast possibly for some of you. It would be like 4x speed. And then when I'm talking, then it'll be slow. So you want to have that consistent 1x the whole time speed. So yeah, just wanted to let you know that. But so I'm not gonna speed through this, but let's keep watching.
Protection to gender identity and gender expression. The first problem with that, although by no means the worst problem, is that gender expression is not a group. And as far as I can tell from reading the Ontario Human Rights Commission website policies, which the federal government announced that the provisions of Bill C-16 would be interpreted within, you can now provisionally be prosecuted under the hate crime legislation federally for criticizing someone's choice of fashion. And I'm not being cynical about that. That's the Ontario Human Rights Commission policies describe gender expression as the manner in which people present themselves through such, while doing everyday activities like shopping, through their choice of clothes and dress. And the idea that requires protection of that magnitude, well, I think it's if you keep extending rights, all you do is weaken them. Rights are one person's rights are another person's responsibilities. And anyways, that's not the worst of it. The worst of it is that the code, the Ontario provisions, which are like lurking behind the federal law and are already law in Ontario, require the use of these so-called preferred pronouns if someone requests them. And I have a variety of objections to that, the most fundamental of which is I believe that the manufactured pronouns, the Z and the ZR and the 50 sort of variants of those are...
Just for a moment, describe what you're referring to there, because I think even among my audience, this is an arcane topic. What are these manufactured pronouns?
Well, it's dogma, I would say, among the radical left that gender is a social construct and that there are multiple variants of gender identity. And some of those don't fit neatly into male-female classifications. The legislation says that people can inhabit any position on that spectrum or not be on the spectrum at all between male and female, which, of course, I find that particular claim essentially incomprehensible. Anyways, the theory is that people who are non-binary, which is the terminology, are entitled to be referred to by pronouns other than he or she, which include they, which would, I suppose, be the most moderate compromise, and then a host of other pronouns that have appeared basically out of the void over the last 10 years, including words like Z and ZR and her, which would be HIR, and them. And there's like 70 different sets of them.
Right.
And there's no agreement whatsoever on which ones should be used. And none of them have entered popular parlance because they are bad solutions to the problem. And the legislation nonetheless necessitates their use. And this is the first time that Canadian government has moved to make a particular kind of speech content mandatory. There are certain limitations on speech, although not very many of them. But this is the first time out of the commercial realm that the actual contents of speech have been made mandatory. And my particular objection to this is that I believe, and I think I have good evidence for believing, that these made-up pronouns, these manufactured pronouns, are part of the lexicon of the radical postmodern / neo-Marxist left. And it's part of their general agenda to occupy the linguistic territory that we use for common parlance. And I don't like their philosophy. In fact, I regard it as reprehensible, to say the least. And because of that, I'm not willing to cede linguistic territory to them, certainly not by being forced to use ideologically saturated as an ideologically saturated lexicon. And so I said I wouldn't do it. I made a video, 3 videos actually, complaining about, let's say, criticizing Bill C-16 and the background legislation, which also, by the way, makes employers responsible for any word that their employees utter that causes anyone any offense, intended or unintended, whether or not the employer knows that utterance occurred, which seems to me a little bit on the draconian side, but I think is in keeping with the same philosophy, which is by no means pro-business. And there are other elements of what's going on in the background that are equally reprehensible. Ontario has set up social justice tribunals. That's their technical name, which gives you some insight into their purpose and into their staffing. One of those is the Ontario Human Rights Commission, and they've basically decided that they have the right to suspend normal legal and judicial procedure, and that they can more or less ascribe to themselves whatever powers they choose, and that's written in their policy statements. And so I'm not very happy about any of that. And so also at the same time, the University of Toronto made it mandatory for their human resources employees to undergo unconscious bias training against racism, which is also something, again, that I don't believe the science for documenting unconscious bias is anywhere near advanced to the point where it should be used as a diagnostic indicator of the potential prejudice of entire classes of people. I don't think there's any question that the tool is too weak to do that, certainly by the standards of appropriate psychometric tests. And there's certainly no evidence that these training programs that are popping up anywhere do any good with regards to prejudice, and a fair bit that they actually make it worse.
Right.
So anyways, I made 2 videos, posted them on my YouTube channel. Mostly, I did it fairly late at night, and I was just trying to think this stuff through, to get it straight in my head and to lay out the argument. And well, the response to them was absolutely insane, really. There's 180 separate newspapers articles written, and 2 protests at the University of Toronto, and I received 2 warning letters from the administration, and a letter of censure from a number of my fellow academics and postdocs and graduate students at the University of Toronto. And it was news, literally. Well, yesterday, the Toronto Star published like a 3,000-word biography of me, and Toronto Life, which is, I suppose, our equivalent to New Yorker, although not in the same league, is going to publish a 5,000-word bio on me. And and then I've talked to Joe Rogan and a whole bunch of other people for podcasts. It's been crazy. But the reason for that is because I made something that was bubbling underneath the surface of our culture, and was certainly bubbling under the surface of yours at the last election. I made it concrete and put forth my objections in an articulate manner, and it struck a chord with people. And
okay, hoping he gets through this soon because I want to get to the other stuff. But I do think that there's some interesting things you can pick apart here. Not really what he was saying. This is all kind of just history at this point. But basically, he was up against certain political ideologies in Canada at the time of recording this. What was this, 2017 or something along those lines? And these coalitions have largely been, they haven't been entirely defeated politically, but they have been very much sidelined and disempowered and blamed for a lot of the failings. Even in the past election, Kamala Harris was largely associated with this type of woke cultural woke culture, essentially, and that seemingly hurt her quite a bit. Like Trump had this very effective ad against her about prison inmates getting sex changes, something along those lines, and it was very effective at getting people to turn on Kamala. And there does seem to be some kind of consensus or mandate that's emerging that some of this stuff has gone a bit too far. I think most people are probably sympathetic to certain sides of these arguments, like just the idea of tolerance and not being racist or sexist and treating everyone as an individual without coming to this with bias. But the extent to which this, and I think also, Jordan Peterson would agree that is a good overall approach to treating others and thinking about others, but it's in the details of how these things have gone too far that's where it really has become deeply unpopular. And in fact, I would say that it has become a liability to those that too deeply associated with it. So even though Kamala Harris wasn't talking about sex changes for prisoners or whatever the things are, the fact that she was associated with that perspective made people dislike her, even if that wasn't on her platform. And across the board, just election after election, the most fringe elements of this kind of woke culture have basically been defeated and have consistently lost power. But what's interesting about that is that how did this arise in the first place? And it seems to me that there were certain groups that were largely isolated from the rest of the world. I mean, this kind of caught a lot of people, it caught them off guard to some extent, because like what he was saying, like Sam Harris was saying, what do you mean by all these pronouns? Explain this to my listeners. People didn't know about they, them. They didn't know about Z's or whatever he was talking about. This was at one point a new thing for most people to learn about. And I think even at this point in 2017, the knowledge of this, the way that these people think, wasn't very widespread. Only certain people online knew about it. A lot of normal people didn't know about it. And so it's interesting to see, though, how these kind of ideologies can stew in these small, closed off groups, and they don't get pressure tested in the larger society. So there were basically in the universities before this, for decades, there was these gender studies programs and these, you could say, cultural Marxist professors who were iterating on this and coming up with new gender theories and coming up with new, basically, ideas for what would then become the woke political movement. And these actually did quite well, and it really swept over the entire university. And it was, while it was contained to a small microcosm of the world, just within the university system, it became super powerful. And that probably peaked around the time of Jordan Peterson coming to prominence, and he was kind of like the needle that poked the balloon to make everything explode. Now, we can't give Jordan Peterson all the credit for the unpopularity of this. I mean, I think if you talk to normal people, like on the street, typically they'll say, there's men and there's women, and we can like be flexible on some of these details, but like roughly speaking, that is the common sense way of thinking about it. And when you go too far away from that, people start getting very uncomfortable. I think that's just an intuitive thing. I don't think that Jordan Peterson convinced people rationally of that. I think they already believed it, but he was like the impetus for maybe the pushback on that perspective to start. But he also brought it to national attention before it started seeping as much into the actual political parties. While it was still in the universities, since they were fighting so hard against him, it brought this issue to prominence, so people started paying a bit more attention. So I don't know if he should get credit for actually discrediting this ideology, but he certainly helped accelerate that process. But I think it would have happened anyway. And the reason why I bring this up is because it's really interesting to see how, as I've said, how there could be an ideology that at a certain scale within a certain group in a certain context appears to be very convincing and very successful. But that's because it hasn't really reached a certain level of prominence in society where it actually is subjected to all of the forces in society that would oppose it. Like it's like in some kind of protected bubble or niche in which it can thrive, but in broader society it doesn't. So like let me give you a few more examples of other things like this, and it's always something that you should watch out for, especially online when you're in some sort of group, and this group has some interesting perspective or worldview, and that worldview is something that it's you think you're right, you think everyone else is wrong. It's kind of like an echo chamber, and it's really easy to see to see a lack of counter arguments against this perspective, or you see a lot of validation for it, and you don't realize that if it's only because there hasn't been much attention placed on it is why it seems to be doing well, and once it does, it's going to start falling apart. So I'll give you some other examples. Cryptocurrency is a really good example of this. There are a lot of people who have thought that they've made bad assumptions about certain properties about cryptocurrency. Like they think, for example, that cryptocurrency will be able to bring about a revolution, like a political revolution, because it allows people to avoid sanctions and stuff like this. And this is not a really good perspective. I've actually debunked this line of thinking in the past, but basically there are some radical libertarians who believe that cryptocurrency is going to really challenge the status quo directly and basically lead to some sort of political revolution. Now, the reason that they think this is because there's a lot of cryptocurrencies that haven't been shut down, that have like certain decentralized properties, and they haven't been shut down by the government. But the reason they haven't been shut down by the government is not because they can't be shut down or they can't be drastically hurt by the government. The reason is because they just are not big enough to really come under government scrutiny. Now, I'm actually very bullish about the future of cryptocurrency and decentralized protocols, but that's not the reason. That's not the reason why it's going to all work out. Cryptocurrency will not foment a revolution. It's not going to work that way. And we can get into that another time. But it just leads to a lot of bad assumptions about cryptocurrency. And also, there's a lot of people that make money in cryptocurrency, and it's really just a small group of wealthy people trading with each other. And a lot of assumptions about how, like, what this means for the way that financial markets will evolve and what the future holds for finance and technology. There's a lot of bad lessons that people learn. And the reason is because crypto is at a very small scale, and you can't just learn a lesson at this small scale and extrapolate that to tell you something about the future of global finance. But maybe a more concrete example of this is AI doom. This is something I've talked about. There's a lot of people, I talked about this earlier in the video, AI people, there's a community of people who believe that AGI, artificial general intelligence, when we have AI that is as smart or smarter than us, that it's going to make us go extinct. And the issue is that there's basically, AI has not been a very successful field for many, many years. So most people weren't even thinking about this problem for a long time, for decades, because if AI doesn't really even work, why would you think about the problems that something that doesn't work can cause if it did work? Because it doesn't work. So the smart people weren't really thinking about it, but there were some very passionate people, and they are also smart. I'm not trying to say they're dumb, but I'm just saying the bulk of the intelligent people were not worried about this, which is essentially a non-problem. But what did happen is there were people who actually got very into this for philosophical reasons. Like they got inspired by science fiction, or they just kind of it was just sparked their interest to worry about the threat of AI. Nobody would be, under that scenario, be particularly passionate about arguing against the threat of AI when AI doesn't even exist. It's not close to existing. It's not very good. It's not a very interesting thing. Like no serious researcher, like let's say that nobody in the world talked about AI, about the threat of AI. You're not going to have someone come along and say, you know what? I just want to really make an argument just to make sure that nobody thinks AI is going to hurt us. I just think that would never happen. And so I'm going to preemptively make a bunch of arguments why it would be safe. Nobody would do that because there's no debate to be had, because nobody's even thinking it would be dangerous in the first place, and it doesn't even work, and it's just like a nonsensical thing. It's like, imagine in 1800 or something, way before computers, someone says, you know what, I think there might be something called computers, and there's going to be this thing called AI, and I'm going to just argue about why it won't kill us. It's like, that's very premature, and there's just no reason to do that. There's more of a reason to argue why it could. So maybe out of those people who perceived that there could be a threat, some of them were thought, you know what, this might be a problem down the road, and so I'm going to preemptively argue why it is dangerous rather than why it is safe. And this group of people has just been making this argument about this basically irrelevant technology for many decades, and now it's gaining in relevance. And now I think that, this discussion is going to be more top of mind to people, and there's going to be a lot of heavy hitters entering in this conversation. But what happened, though, is there grew a community of passionate people who were basically looking at basically making these arguments that AI was going to kill us, and it was not pressure tested. It was in this small group, and it seemed to be, it was a very dominant philosophy within this group and within this niche of people called rationalists and effective altruists. And when this ideology comes to actually reach a level of becomes prominent at a national scale, I think it's going to be torn apart, and I think it'll become very unpopular. But as of now, the issue is that there's certain people who will debate this. There's going to be someone like Eliezer Yudkowsky, who is an AI doomer, and he is going to make a very compelling case that AI will kill us, if you're naive and don't know why he's wrong. And he's thought about it a lot, so he has a lot of really great things to say. And then he's going to debate someone who just is a part-time hobbyist in this subject, like Robin Hanson, who's a brilliant economist, but he doesn't think that much about this, doesn't care that much. He does all this other stuff. And so he's not gonna, he relatively to other people has done a lot of thinking and research about this. But my point in saying that is basically the doomers are way more prepared. And so it makes it seem like the case against doom is really weak, when in fact it's just that nobody has thought about it because it's been kind of obviously not a problem or not something that needs to be thought about. So, but then, as doom increases its scale, then we realize, we actually need to, if it starts to influence policy, there's going to be much more of an incentive to scrutinize it and to actually push back on it and put forth ideas against it. So that's just another example, but there's a lot of examples. And the reason why I bring this up is just because it's important to be careful. It's when you're in an online niche, it's important to be careful about have these ideas been pressure tested? It may seem compelling, but it's really hard to fully get to the bottom of these things. So just avoid echo chambers, avoid buying into things that seemingly are convincing. Because, at some point you get to a certain scale. If you've hitched your horse to that wagon, if you hitched your horse to woke ideology, you're kind of a political loser right now. And ultimately it just wasn't the right choice, even though it was this very compelling thing for a certain group of people back about 10 years ago. And one thing, I'll just say really quick before we continue watching, is I have encountered this. I was a radical libertarian at one point, and I was very bought into this. I don't think that this holds up outside of that echo chamber. These ideas have been around for a long time, and a lot of people have been exposed to these ideas, and they've never taken hold on a national level within U.S. politics, or honestly there maybe Liechtenstein has adopted that, but that's such a small case. It's anomalous. Really, Austro-libertarian, anarcho-capitalist, Rothbardian ideas have not taken hold. And there's a reason for that. And that's a whole separate episode. I really should do an episode on that. That would be very interesting. But anyway, that's just my warning to you. Don't be like the wokesters. Be smart. Be humble. And yes, so, okay, let's continue listening to Jordan.
And it's actually been news not only in Canada, but it's stretched its tentacles down to the States and certainly into Western Europe and Australia and New Zealand. And I'm being interviewed in South Africa this week, and it's been like being in a ship in a storm, and it's dumbfounding.
I can imagine it's been stressful, I'm sure. Now, is your job at the University of Toronto in jeopardy? Is that the kind of communication you've received, or?
Well, I received 2 warning letters basically asking me to stop talking about this, based on the idea that even mentioning the fact that I might not use these pronouns probably contravened the Ontario Human Rights Code and also the University Code of Conduct, although hypothetically the university's Code of Conduct is dominated by protection for free speech. And so they kind of did the typical HR thing and got the lawyers on it, and they're conservative. And, they warned me twice. I didn't stop talking about it, but then the university was roundly criticized by a number of Canada's major journalists, including a coalition of
just pausing it for a sec. There's fires in LA right now, and I'm burning things up. And so there's these winds here in California. I live in Southern California. I'm not in LA, thankfully, but there's these winds in Southern California called Santa Ana winds, and they are very harsh, and that's what caused the fire to spread. Anyway, we have some crazy winds going on right now. My neighbor's tree just fell down. I need to go and just do something on my property just to make sure everything's fine. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to keep listening, and I'm going to play this. And since he's talking about this, I don't think we're going to miss anything. And so I'm going to be right here with you, even though it is, I won't be in the frame. I will be listening, and then I will react as needed to this. So let me just expand my, how do I extend this? Oh, I'm trying to make this full screen so that it looks better when I'm gone. You know what? Whatever. Who cares? I'm just going to continue playing it, and you can listen, and I will be listening too, and then I'll be back, and then I will react.
100 newspapers, and they got a lot of bad press. The press actually turned in support of me quite hard about 2 weeks after this started, when they started to investigate what I was talking about and found out that I actually that my claims weren't exaggerated by any stretch of the imagination. And so
I've seen that criticism. I've paid attention to what you've been saying on this topic, and some people have said that you are at least mistaken about the legal implications of these changes in the law or these rulings. But it seems to me the one thing you can't be mistaken about is the treatment you have received thus far in response to your saying you won't use these pronouns.
If the university lawyers hadn't been convinced that I was correct in my interpretation, they wouldn't have sent out a warning that I should stop doing it because it might be illegal. That's the best piece of proof supporting my position that the law has this draconian element, because, they didn't send me those letters incautiously. They had their lawyers review the damn legislation and then came to the same conclusion that I did.
Right.
And the 2 lawyers who have been making these claims that this legislation is far more innocuous than I'm making it out to be are both social activist lawyers. And so they have a serious agenda. And one of them, Brenda Kosman, told me, that I wouldn't go to jail, although that is a possibility, despite what she said, because the law does have that power. All that would happen is that essentially I could be financially ruined. It's like, that's not draconian at all,
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
and the Ontario Human Rights Commission has managed to demolish lots of people's lives. It's a kangaroo court, in my opinion, and a very dangerous one at that.
One thing we absolutely agree about is that freedom of speech is not just one among many different values. It really is the master value, because it's the only corrective to human stupidity. It's the only mechanism by which we can improve our society. And in fact, it's the value that allows us to improve our other values through conversation.
Yes, that's exactly right. It's the fundamental value. It's exactly right. It's the fundamental value upon which our entire cultural edifice is predicated. And I believe that that's part of the reason why the postmodern radicals in particular are opposed to freedom of speech, because they don't believe in dialogue. They don't believe in rationality. They don't believe that groups who have different orientations of power can discuss their differences in a civilized manner and reach resolution, because that isn't how they see the world. That's how modernists see the world, but postmodernists don't believe any of that, and they seriously don't believe it. It's not a facade it's a very entrenched part of their philosophy. So that's partly why they don't like to, why they block speakers who oppose their views from campus, and why they're perfectly willing to shut them down, and why they don't, why they have no platforming policies, which is basically the decision not to let anyone who holds alternative views have a forum even.
Okay, I'm back. So it's interesting listening to that segment while I was out, just right over there. It's interesting to hear Sam Harris talk about free speech and how basically it's something that you can, doesn't matter what the topic is. There's no exceptions. It's just like one of those things that you need to have. When I do believe that he was actually recently has come very strongly against free speech around COVID misinformation. So it's interesting. I don't know if he would still make that same argument. He'd probably have some reason why he believes that that's true. But actually, in this case, somehow that doesn't apply, like some sort of loophole. But it does definitely seem like an apparent contradiction in the claims that he's made in the past versus what his current positions are. But anyway, let's keep listening. And I really want to get to this part about where we talk about what is truth.
And it's because they don't believe in rational dialogue and the possibility of reaching a solution through it.
There's something, at least on its face, so wrong-headed about this pronoun campaign that it makes me feel like I don't understand something about it.
Well, you don't. There's something more nefarious lurking at the bottom of it. And you see, in Canada, I know that you're not a social constructionist. I know that you, like Steven Pinker, believe deeply that human behavior is profoundly influenced by its underlying biological substrate, which is another view that we share. But Canada has now written a social constructionist view of human identity into the law. So it's illegal, at least in principle, to claim that biology has anything to do with gender identity, or that biology and gender identity have anything to do with gender expression, or that any of those three have anything to do with social orientation in a causal manner.
Right.
And that's written into the law. So what the social justice warriors are going to do next is to go after the biologists. And, they did that with E.O. Wilson already back, 30 years.
Another interesting point is I rarely hear the term social justice warrior anymore. I think, I think at one point it wasn't a derogative term. I think now it's almost used, what would be like not like sarcastically, but it's, it's one of those things where, it's like you're a warrior, social justice warrior. Like it's like we are mocking it when you say that. But I think at one point it might have been actually like a term that people use to describe themselves. I'm not fully sure about that, but I definitely don't hear that as much anymore. And it just kind of goes to show how much of a decisive victory, cultural victory, Jordan Peterson's perspective has had against the woke crowd. But let's keep listening.
Years ago, and they're doing it in Germany right now. And there's an anti-psychiatry scholarship established at the Ontario Institute for the Study of Education, which is a particularly pernicious institution. And it's no longer obvious what sort of claims you can make as a scientist about the relationship between biology and sex, or the hypothetically separate gender identity.
Right.
So that's the worst of the lot, because normally governments shy away from implementing a particular ideology, especially one that's discredited, which certainly the radical social constructionist position is, to make that a fundamental part of the law, and that's definitely happened. And
to those who don't believe me about this victory, I mean, let's just see that Trump signed an executive order. He just was inaugurated a couple of days ago, and he's already signed an executive order saying that the U.S. will view there to only be two sexes, male and female. So that just goes to the extent to which this has been a bit of a flash in the pan, this woke movement that they're talking about.
That'll unfold in a particularly nasty way over the next 10 years.
Ideology aside, there's just a difference between a positive and negative injunction. So I can ask you to stop doing an infinite number of things, and that imposes no energy cost on you. I can say, stop using the N-word. It offends me, right? Or stop littering, or stop driving your car on the sidewalk, right? And you can not do those things, and it takes no time not to do those things. It takes no cognitive overhead not to do those things. But I can't ask you to do an infinite number of things. I can't tell you to pick up all the litter you see everywhere, because you'd spend the rest of your life doing that, and you still would fail to comply with the injunction. And asking people to learn a new list of gender pronouns, and then...
Yeah, so I don't agree with this. I get where he's going with this. This is a common libertarian talking point, something I used to believe myself. But the issue is that when you really drill down, like a lot of people say, oh, that's not what rights are. Rights are something it's negative, not positive. So for example, you can have a right to free speech, but you can't have a right to healthcare, because healthcare, if you have to get a doctor to do it. So you're now enslaving the doctor in order to force them to give you the healthcare. And that's not the same thing as free speech, which is you say whatever you want and it doesn't add a burden to anyone. That's all well and fine. You can say that, you can have that be your preference. But and I've said this myself, like this has been a position I've held, but at the end of the day, when you drill down on that perspective, it just doesn't hold up. There's no actual reason why you need to construct rights this way. And while you're right, it would be ridiculous to ask someone to pick up all the litter. Is it though? Is it really ridiculous? I mean, how much litter do you see? There probably would be within some reason that you would let them not actually always pick up litter, and you can just kind of say like, these are the rules. This is how we think. Like, you deserve this. It's okay to construct rights that way. I don't see an actual good reason not to construct rights that way. Certainly in this case, you could even frame this as a negative thing. So if you don't, like, they call this misgendering. So they say, use this pronoun instead of that pronoun. And so that is, in a sense, you can say, don't misgender. Just don't, like he said, don't say the N-word. Well, you can say, well, don't misgender me. So don't call me he. I mean, you can say, I go by they or whatever. You can say that. But you're not forcing someone to say they. Like you're not saying like, say they right now. Well, instead, you're just saying, if you refer to me, please do not use these other pronouns. And this is the one that I will not find offensive. So it's like, maybe if you'd have a list of N-words and you say, these are all N-words to me, and then except for this one. So if you want to refer to me, which you don't have to do, then please use this one. Otherwise, it's like using the N-word. That in that way, you can kind of equate these things. And again, I'm not like advocating for this, but I just don't think that Sam Harris's analysis here is particularly helpful.
And live in a state of vigilance to see that they apply them correctly. This is a positive injunction, and you're demanding that people do something. For me to demand that people start using a word of my own invention, or if I say, I want to be addressed by a 16-digit number, and I'm going to be offended if you get the number wrong, this is imposing a cost on people.
I'm going to be offended, and I'm going to take you to court, and you could be charged under hate speech, and I could change that pronoun in an hour if I want, or tomorrow, or the next day on a whim.
I do think, and not to get caught too much on this, though, it does really make you think, like, what is the difference between what they're saying and the N-word? Like, they could, for example, be upset about not being able to say the N-word. And you can say, you can't tell me what to do. Like, you're going to make me not refer to you as the N-word, like blah, blah, blah. You could kind of map all their arguments on. And the things that they're saying are the reasons why this is so ridiculous. Like the fact that, they could change their pronouns. And they just decided, they made up this word. To me, that is not doesn't explain why it's so bad. That those seem like details that maybe are a bit upsetting, but it doesn't seem to like fundamentally change in nature this scenario from a scenario about using the N-word. I think a better response to this is something just more along the lines of basically like just nobody really agrees with it, and it's ridiculous, and you just don't think it appeals to common sense values that other people have. And it's basically just some small group with some culture, and you don't really, honestly, you have to kind of admit that you don't respect them enough to go along with their scheme. Like, to some extent, like the reason why people don't say the N-word is out of respect for Black people. And it's like there is a kind of a widespread decision where you say, this is offensive to Black people, and we respect them as a group, and we feel bad for what happened to them, etc. You can go down the list of your reasons, but out of respect, like, you don't want them to be angry at you because they're a group that you value them not being angry at you. There's respect there. There's admiration, and there could be a fear-based respect, or there could be other types of respect. The point is, though, is fundamentally, these people at the universities that were imposing these wacky laws, it just wasn't a group that in the end was someone that Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris respect. These kind of people with the dyed hair that were screaming, etc. Like, this is just not the group that you don't fear them, you don't admire them, there's nothing they have to offer you. They just kind of make a lot of noise. And that has worked within certain circles within the university for a long time. That dominated. People did respect them in those circles. They did wield power and influence. But when that has come to broader society, people basically, like, when I think about this, if I had a son or daughter who was in university and believed in these things, I would be totally fine with that. I would be totally fine if they held this kind of woke ideology. And the reason why I'd be fine with that is because I'm glad that this is what they have to think about and worry about. I'm glad that this is the level of hardship that they have in their life, that they are basically playing around with these social games and just doing this stuff. I think that is a wonderful thing, that they don't have bigger fish to fry. And they're just naive children. And there's some old people who never really grew up who are kind of just playing around in this insignificant sphere of basically doing nothing. And it doesn't matter. Like, it's like, I'm glad that they can just, like, I want my children to just have a great childhood and just have a great life and not stress and just, eat healthy, exercise, and be a healthy person that doesn't go through hardship and has a family of their own. I don't want them to have to struggle. I don't want them to have to be right about things. Like, being right about things, like, that's a hard thing to do. You have to contend with reality. Like Elon Musk, when he makes rockets, he has to really get the calculations right. Otherwise, the whole thing explodes. Why should you want your kids to have to do that? I hope that they find meaning in all of that. I think that's all well and good. But I'm so happy. I would be happy just to see someone, spend their time learning about things, debating things, talking about things that they enjoy, whether that's gender politics or, like me, I talk about technology. I think that's great. And being right is like a very hard thing to do, and it's very difficult, and you have to have a lot of humility, and you have to look in the mirror and criticize yourself when you're wrong, and you can never let yourself relax if you're really worried about being right, because everything's always changing. And I think that's like, at the end of the day, like, when these woke people came into these corporations and started actually enacting like HR policies based on their ideology, that's when things got a little bit, this is when the pushback really started, when it actually started making corporations less profitable, when productive work was harmed, and then people whose retirements were invested in these companies started getting lower returns because they were not producing as much. And maybe that wasn't exactly happening, but the writing was on the wall. You saw that this was like a destructive trend towards productivity. And it's because they weren't in touch with reality, or at least they were occupied with things that were probably less important, and they put the wrong emphasis on certain things. And that's where, being wrong matters. But I don't think it's like a big deal that people were wrong necessarily. But anyway, let's continue. Let's continue. I just think that, like, it's fine that they go do this. Let's just not give them any power. I don't listen to them. I don't particularly. I want them to just go off and do their thing. And I'm glad that they're able to go and do those, whatever their side hobby is, whether it's gender ideology or building apps, technology, or whatever. So let's keep listening though.
Because that's also part of the legislation, because that covers the people who are so-called gender fluid. And so they have the right to transform their identity according to their subjective whim, I would say, because the legislation also assumes that this identity that's being protected so hard has no grounding in biology, and it's only subjectively determined. So they actually go beyond social constructionism to make it essentially solipsistic. It's the only thing that determines your identity is the way that you feel at that time. So that's an unbelievably poverty-stricken notion of identity, which at minimum.
I gotta say though, I mean, there is also, some element to which that's a good thing. Again, I don't want to find myself defending these people who I said basically have completely lost the political battle. But I think it's kind of nice that some people could focus on basically create. They're in such a hospitable environment that they can actually create new abstractions that are functional for these things like gender. So, for example. If you think about it, what's really interesting is at all times we are at war. And what I mean by that is if I, as a fighting age male, wanted to sign up to kill people, no matter where I was in the world, and maybe some people wouldn't trust me because of my racial or ethnic background, depending on where I am, but basically give a given male at a given location, they can do all kinds of things. They can work in a factory. They could be a programmer. They could, build houses. But one of the jobs that's always available is fighting and killing people. And if you're willing to kill people, it sounds almost disgusting and sick that's that could be a job. What are you going to do? Join a gang or something? No, there's militaries at every inch of the earth. And there's always employment for those who wish to sign up to kill and die for a group. And in that sense, we are always at war. And so if you're in, for example, Mexico, right, there's cartels, you can join cartels, they're recruiting, but there's also the military of the state of Mexico. And then there's, US forces might get involved. So there's at any time, at any given geographic location, think about Syria, all these different factions, they're all there. And we are in a perpetual state of war, either implicitly threatening war or explicitly enacting war. This is happening at all times around us. And if you look at expenditures, you see so much money goes to military around the world, et cetera, et cetera. So this is not something that most people think about. People don't think about things in this militaristic, bellicose terms. They just think about whatever the concerns of their day-to-day life is. They think of some abstract thing of social justice or civil rights or doing the right thing and charity and just a lot of these nice to haves that are almost higher on the hierarchy than base survival and conflict. It's nice that we live in such a stable society where we can think about what is your career going to be? What are your hobbies? Who do you love? Who do you want to what do you want to do on Friday? These are concerns that we take for granted, the fact that we can think about things in this abstract sense where almost there's no consequences. You're not fearing. You're just basically you just work hard and you will succeed. And you just do the right thing and everything works out. This is the way that a lot of people in developed countries can think these days, but that's just not the reality of the world. If you are in certain places, every single day is a struggle, and you're basically fighting for your survival, and you don't get to focus on these higher level aspirational things. And it's nice when we get to do that, but it is not in touch with reality. It is divorced from the scientific reality of the situation we're in. We are in a perpetual state of war. And even in the United States, we are at war on all fronts. It's just that for most citizens, we are insulated from this reality, and we can construct a fantasy about what the world really is and what's really important when it's actually not true. But it functionally works inside the context of our environment. And so that is a great success for the country. And if we can create a system that transcends basically makes an even more fantastical notion functional, meaning like something that's even more crazy and idealistic. If that can actually become a functional mode of operating, to some extent, that that is a good thing. If people can like, I don't want to be male, I want to be this or that. If that is something that people want to do, and that actually it works, it is a functional way of operating in our society. The fact that you are male and you're no longer constrained by that in any way, that's a good thing. That's progress. So I guess that's kind of like what progressivism could be conceptualized as in some sense. But with all that said, I don't think in the end, I don't think that this was functional. I think it was weaponized, and I think it played off of a lot of good intentions that people had about being inclusive, and inclusivity is very important to me. Tolerance, inclusivity, these are really important things. And I think basically this just kind of tugged on those heartstrings and was basically a political tool to bludgeon people who stepped out of line. And so ultimately, I don't think this was a functional way of living. And it just wasn't common sense at the end of the day. It didn't work. It didn't increase the fitness of those in the system that used it, maybe within some very small confines of the university, but not in the broader society. So that's more the problem with it. It just ended up not being functional. But I don't think there any of these like philosophical problems that they were identifying were actually real problems, to be honest. Like these are just like nitpicks and things like, oh, they can change in any moment. Like, well, why is that fundamentally important? Why does that make this like, worse than like, why is this different than not being able to say the N-word? Well, it's not because they can change at any moment. There's something else to it. So anyway, let's keep listening.
Is something that you have to negotiate with other people. I mean, it has to be functional, and you have to negotiate it with other people. So, well, it's not understandable unless you look underneath it, and that's why I was objecting, because I think it's a perfectly reasonable manifestation of the postmodernism that's nested in neo-Marxism. It's perfectly in keeping with their stated aims. So, and those aims are not, if you are an admirer of Western culture, at least the good parts of Western culture, then you're the enemy of the postmodern / neo-Marxists. They're opposed to absolutely everything you believe.
We're going to get into that territory, I would imagine, by another route. So I don't think there's more to say here, because I think we probably agree about everything. I'm obviously not a lawyer. I'm certainly not a Canadian lawyer. So if there's any way in which we're getting some of the legal details wrong, I offer a blanket apology. But in terms of the belief that biology doesn't significantly determine gender or sexuality, or the wisdom and utility of inventing new identities and demanding that everyone keep track of them in perpetuity. I mean, I think you and I more or less totally overlap there. So I think we should just move on.
No, you better not come to Canada and have that discussion then.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's been bizarre to see some of these encounters you've been having, but this is why you've suddenly become so visible to people, and it's very interesting to see that this is how it's manifesting. But we have bigger, deeper, more perennial fish to fry. I think we need to talk about religion and science and atheism and the foundations of morality, things like meaning, your interest in mythology of nihilism. Let's get into all of that. I think you and I share some fundamental concerns, and we feel a similar kind of urgency. I think it expresses itself in slightly different ways and different ways of talking, but we feel an urgency that our fellow human beings get certain questions right. But I think we probably disagree about some fundamental matters, and whether we imagine truth in truth as things are, and it tells how you act. Let's talk about that. And I got connect to this Darwinian concerns.
Now that's a good. I'm going to approach that obliquely to begin with. So let me throw a couple of things at you. And I know that you don't accept Hume's distinction between an is and an ought. That you're willing to challenge that, and fair enough. It's a reasonable thing to try to challenge, although it's quite difficult. But that doesn't mean it's impossible. But I've been thinking a lot about the essential philosophy.
Okay, before he gets to his line of thinking, I want to talk a little bit about just that question that was raised by Sam Harris, and I'm just going to tell you my thoughts on it before we hear Jordan's. And I apologize if there's a any sort of latency on this stream. I was kind of trying to adjust the video because it seemed to be going in and out, but I think it's better now. Anyway, so here's my perspective on this. I think that science is a method of understanding things in the world. And so as an example, there's a lot of things that we do not have a toolkit to understand. For example, if you look at very small things like subatomic particles, we have no understanding of how those work. And so in order to kind of understand what's going on at that level, we need to employ something called the scientific method. And the scientific method is basically a way that we can test hypotheses and see if we can build predictive models for what works in reality. And that's what science is. And so we have like an understanding of certain things, and these things are typically things that were in our evolutionary environment, our ancestral environment as we evolved as humans, and we have these models, and we have this capacity for reasoning, and this capacity for reasoning is shaped by the kind of models that were selected for in evolution. Now, we also have this adaptability, and this adaptability basically allows us to learn about things that we were not directly exposed to in our ancestral environment. So that's when science comes in. Science basically allows us to build a model in a rigorous way where we are actually able to understand and predict the behavior. We're constructing models to predict the behavior of various things. That's what science does. That's all it is. It's a process of finding a statistically significant deviation from random behavior, and so that we can build up models that more accurately predict the world. They're not perfect, but they, over time, following the scientific process will get us to have a better understanding of the world, because we're going to have models that more often predict what is going to happen in the world. And furthermore, there's more ways than just the scientific method to do that. There are a variety of optimization techniques that can be employed. AI can do that without actually running the scientific method. Evolution did that without explicitly doing the scientific method. It's basically, though, what it is it's there is empirical data that's collected in the world. There's hypotheses that are tested, and there's results that then select a model for, or construct a model that is predictive. And so that's the process that science fulfills. Now, what that doesn't do, though, is there are limits to what that is useful for. So, for example, that doesn't tell us what we, it doesn't tell us what is moral. It doesn't tell us, I mean, it can give us insight into some of these questions depending on how you're thinking about it, but it doesn't tell us a lot of things about our existence. And so it doesn't tell us like how we ought to behave. It doesn't tell us about like what is the optimal actions we should take in any given moment if we want to achieve a certain goal. It's not necessarily an ought from it is. Maybe it's just a practical thing like, I want to get some food. What should I do? That's not a scientific question. Some science could play a role in it, but especially as you get to have more abstract goals, like I want to live a meaningful life and stuff like this, science really breaks down in its ability to tell you what concrete steps you should take along the way in order to achieve that. And so another place that science typically fails is in places where we can't run experiments. So for example, if you're talking about the economy, like economics is pretty unscientific, and I think it fails at predicting things in a lot of cases. Economists are in some sense extraordinarily unreliable and unhelpful. And it's because they're not able to run experiments on these economic systems, and therefore we're not really able to get any good data to actually understand what's happening. You have to piece together a lot of just observational data, and that just is so much harder to extract statistically significant signal from. So all that is to say that there are limits to what science can answer. And at some point, if you're really talking about what you ought to do in the world and how you can, and like these kind of like very big questions, science just doesn't get you there. And I know Sam Harris thinks that it can. I just completely disagree with that. And like one of the reasons is like, there's no way that you can fundamentally steer the future in a direction that you want it to go. It's a complex system, and you just simply do not have the wherewithal to actually influence the course of history. It's just kind of a fundamental fact about the society itself being a complex system, that it's not predictable and not controllable by just manipulating the inputs. So, and if you can predict all of society, you would become easily the richest person ever. You would become the king of the world. Unfortunately, you're simply not going to be able to do that. That's just not a realistic thing. It's not possible. So I don't think Sam Harris can predict what's going to happen in the future. He can't predict he can't predict what actions will steer society. So therefore, he's not able to actually, like, let's say he has some sort of ideal that he thinks that he can derive is something desirable. Like, let's say he wants everyone to be happy. Okay, you want everyone in the world to be happy. That would be an ideal end state. That's a nice goal. That would be so great. I wish everybody was happy too. Now, the problem is you don't know what kind of actions you need to take to get there. You could take an action, like you could start like a charity that tries to, figure out ways to make people happy. But actually, the fact of the matter is that you don't actually know the magnitude or the direction in which that is steering people toward or away from your goal. Like, you could create a charity that helps people become happy, and that charity could actually somehow make people less happy in the long run. And the reason is that you can't tell, there's no way of predicting the way that your actions are going to have an effect, like on society. Like, you could take one action and then that could kind of like seem to push things forward, but that could be part of like a super cycle, like reverting back in some other way. Like, for example, these woke people were let me think about it this way. Like, let's say like progressive economics. They allied themselves with woke people, and they were pushing for their perspective. The people who value progressive economics. So maybe they made some headway by advocating their progressive economics, but then in doing so, they actually hitched their wagon to wokeism, and now there is a super cycle of wokeism was in a super cycle going downwards while progressive economics is going forward. So you went forward into prominence within woke circles, then you get dragged back by several steps, because when wokeism got pushed back, progressivism also got pushed back along with it. So even though you made some headway, you actually ended up further from where you started. That might have been a little bit abstract, but the point is that society is a complex system, and we cannot determine we cannot steer the future. It's just fundamentally impossible, and you don't know how your actions are going to affect society in the medium term. You can say in the short term, you can make certain predictions, but you don't actually know how that is going to play out in the medium term. The future is overdetermined. So there are many reasons for everything, and you are not going to be the linchpin that changes history's course. And if you are, you're not going to know that you did that. It can be a chaotic system, but you don't know that you are going to be the one who, like, you aren't going to be able to consciously choose for society what that fork in the road is. You think these systems are just way more powerful, the systems at play, and are way more powerful than you, and you cannot understand them. This is a fundamental fact about reality. And so, and one of the reasons you can't understand them is because you can't run the scientific method, which is what we're talking about, on the whole system. So there's just certain things that you can't know. And so all that is to say that it's just fundamentally unpredictable. And so that's where, if religion has a role, it comes into this area where since society is so complex and you can't determine where your actions will lead, even if you know what the end goal you want society to look like, which perhaps you can't even know that from science in the first place. But let's say that you could, then you wouldn't even know how to get there. And so that's where religion comes into play. Religion provides a framework for taking action in the world because it suggests a set of morals, and these morals have been tested over time. So, like, for example, Sam Harris could have his own moral philosophy that explains why he believes the things that he believes, and he can have constructed this and make these great arguments. But this is not something, it's not Lindy, it's not old. This is something that he just came up with. So the actual utility that this has in the world has yet to be established. Going back to some of these like ancient beliefs that have endured to today, there's a lot of embedded wisdom in them. And the fact that they have lasted over centuries or millennia and have continued to thrive shows a certain level of resilience to changing circumstances, and a degree to which those who practice these religions have gained Darwinian fitness over those that haven't. It has somehow been advantageous. So just in the fact that these things have endured, you know that you don't know what the wisdom in them is per se, but there is some embedded wisdom that that basically makes them useful and makes them compelling for people across time. And no matter what no matter how compelling of an argument Sam Harris can make for his moral framework, he doesn't have time on his side. And fundamentally, the world is too complex for us to rationally analyze what actions we ought to take in the world. It's just far too complex. And so there's no, like, at the end of the day, if you think you're convinced by Sam Harris's arguments, at the end of the day, you're probably just not thinking clearly, and you probably just don't even know how to reason about complex systems. You are more likely mistaken that his ideas are compelling rather than them actually being better than the alternatives, which would be religion. So that's the rule. And so just like as a disclaimer, like, I'm not religious myself. I'm interested in being religious. I want to be religious. I'm still kind of deciding like what that looks like, what religion is true and all of that. But it's an area that I think adds a lot of value because it can help you orient your life. And when you know that you're not going to be able to steer the course of reality because you are not going to change the future. It's just not going to happen. Society is complex. You're not going to steer the direction of history. It's just a fact. It's just a fact of probability. Those odds are astronomically low. It's just not going to happen. And so given this, how do you orient yourself? What should you do on a day-to-day basis? What set of course of action should you take? Since you don't, like if you're walking to the store and you know it's due north, you're just going to keep walking north. That's a simple place that you're trying to go. And this is a simple way to determine your actions. Just walk north. If you are trying to, if you don't know where you're going, if you in life, you don't know what goals you should have, you don't know how you want to shape the world, you don't know how to decide, or even if you know those things, you don't know what actions would get you to this place that you want to go, then you need a framework for deciding what type of actions you should take. And at the end of the day, I think like on a practical level, this is a really good way of thinking about it. Because if you always do the quote unquote right thing, be it just based on your personal morals or based on religion, if you always do the right thing, you might not always get the right outcome. You might not always get the outcome that you desire, because the world is unpredictable. You don't know. Sometimes even you do everything right and something fails. It's Murphy's Law. Everything always goes wrong. These things happen. There's no guarantee of success in anything. You could be the most brilliant person and never be successful at business or in your field. You could be born into a family of alcoholics that beat you and you never live up to your potential. There's so many things that are outside of your control. Even if you deserve it, even if you are great, you can still fail. But that can be very hard if you're so tied to the outcome, because there's just forces that are out of your control and that are always going to be acting upon you throughout the entirety of your life. However, if you are able to orient yourself to just do something following a system that has been proven over time to give you moral guidance, and that we know there's embedded wisdom in that, and you can immerse yourself in that, you can always feel good about what you're doing, because at least you know that you did the right thing. At least you know you did what God told you, so to speak. And like, if you're not, religious and you don't buy into any specific religion, my advice to you is don't think about it rationally, but just, try to do the right thing and just use your intuitive sense of what's right and wrong, and just always, operate with honor, and don't get tied to the outcome, because the outcome can totally change and it's not under your control. What is under control is your actions. And if you just do the right thing, you'll always feel good about yourself. So anyway, let's keep listening and see what Jordan has to say on this topic.
Contradiction between a Newtonian worldview, which I would say your view is nested inside, and a Darwinian worldview, because those views are not the same. They're seriously not the same. I mean, the Darwinian view, as the American pragmatists recognized, so that was William James and his crowd, recognized almost immediately, was a form of pragmatism. And the pragmatists claimed that the truth of a statement or process can only be adjudicated with regards to its efficiency in attaining its aim. And so their idea was that truths are always bounded because we're ignorant, and every action that you undertake that's goal directed has an internal ethic embedded in it, and the ethic is the claim that if what you do works, then it's true enough, and that's all you can ever do. And what Darwin did, as far as the pragmatists were concerned, was to put forth the following proposition, which was that it was impossible for a finite organism to keep up with a multi-dimensionally transforming landscape, environmental landscape, let's say. And so the best that could be done was to generate random variants, kill most of them because they were wrong, and let the others that were correct enough live long enough to propagate, whereby the same process occurs again. So it's not like the organism is a solution to the problem of the environment. The organism is a very bad partial solution to an impossible problem. Okay, and the thing that about that is that you can't get outside that claim. I can't see how you can get outside that claim if you're a
Okay, yeah, this is good. So let me just kind of like drill down on what he's saying here. Basically, Darwinism is a process. It's a search process, and it's a search process that's also adaptable. So what Darwinism seeks is basically, you can think of like this abstract metric called Darwinian fitness. And so you want something that is a more fit. You want it selects for the most fit version of a thing. So you have an organism, and the organism, what it will do is it will procreate. So there's going to now be like multiple children organisms. Each one of these is going to be slightly different than the others. They're not going to necessarily, I mean, there's some exceptions to this, but typically there is going to be some variation amongst the different instantiations of this organism. And Jordan was saying that this was random. I don't think it's random. I think a lot of people have proven at this point that it's not random selection that happens. It's not it's not random variation and mutation. It's a non-random process, but there's some kind of evolutionary model that is encoded into the genes that predicts smart mutations. It's not just any mutation. It's not random mutation. It's actually, there's some level of intelligent selection going on in the actual mutation process on the gene level. So this stuff is happening. And what happens is essentially you have all of these instantiations of like these slight variations of the same thing. And some of them will be more fit and some of them will be less fit. So let's just take a very simple example about like a bird, and one will have a short beak and one will have a long beak. Now, the long-beaked bird, maybe they're on an island where the water is within the ground. I mean, this is weird. Like the fresh water is like within the ground. I'm making this up. And you can, stick your beak in there and you can drink the water. But now the short-beaked bird would not be able to, but the long-beaked bird would. So what this would do is this would then select the long-beaked bird because it would have a higher level of Darwinian fitness. And the short-beaked bird would perish. So this was essentially a search for a beak model. They tried different variations of the beak, and it found it optimized the beak that was the most fit in the context of this environment. Now, let's say that now there's predators on the island, and now the water levels rose, and now you don't need a long beak, and now the long beak weighs you down. Now, that could be a changing environment, and now it's an adaptable process, so now it can go back and start selecting shorter beaks. But the point is that this is a search problem, and a search problem is actually similar to AI. We can relate this to AI. This is essentially how AI works. There's a neural network, and what you do is you basically train the network, you feed in data, and you make it give a prediction. And then what you do is once the neural network gives a prediction, you measure how wrong it was, and then you adjust it. You would actually adjust the numbers inside of the neural network so that they give a more accurate prediction. And what you do is you keep basically you measure how well the neural network performs, and then you teach the neural network a lesson based on how wrong it was. And you do that a bunch of different times, and it will gradually adjust its own implementation until it actually has a very high level of predictability. And so it's actually the same process. These are both optimization processes, and neural networks are searching for a function that has a low error, it has a minimized error. It's an optimum, a minimum. An optimized error that's low. And Darwinian fitness is searching for, or the process of Darwinism, the evolutionary process, is selecting for the gene combinations that have a high level of Darwinian fitness. And so that is the method, that this is basically the sense in which Darwinism is a search process. So he's saying that this is a foundational and inescapable truth, and now he's going to build on this. I'm going to go back like 15 seconds or so, and then we can continue just so we get like what he was saying on the tail end, and then we'll continue listening.
Environment, the organism is a very bad partial solution to an impossible problem. Okay, and the thing that about that is that,
so the impossible problem is that the organism is a partial solution because it is an iteration. It's an attempt that was basically searched for, and it's going to be a continual process. It's an impossible problem because the environment is constantly changing. There is no right answer it's context dependent. So you can never, there's not a truth statement, but there is a partial solution, like a temporarily most fit instantiation of this overall organism. And one thing I'll say is like, so then like, let's just kind of like anticipate his argument here. The implication of this is if you extrapolate, like if you have one organism that is relatively stable throughout time and doesn't need to evolve, or it's certain traits within an organism that have remained stable, what you can say is that those have been functional across a variety of contexts. And in a sense, now, in a sense, I think what he's going to do is he's going to draw an analogy between that and truth. And so in some ways that makes sense, and in some ways it doesn't. So let me give you a way in which that doesn't make sense. Let's say that birds have beaks, and this endures for across a very long time scale. Would you say that beaks are true as a result of that? I think that there is a way that you can argue that, but it doesn't really make sense. How would you say beaks are true? That doesn't really make much sense on an intuitive level. But now I want to give you a different version. Now, let's say that we have like when I hold a rock, like here's my phone, right? This phone has, I can throw it as a projectile. Like I can launch it up in the air and it will go up and down and it'll fall to the ground. I have a model in my head about what is going to happen, how gravity will act on this object. It's an intuitive understanding that I have developed. And I know that basically if I throw it and I can try and throw it in the trash can or something, like you can take a paper ball and throw it in the trash can, right? I have an understanding that this is how gravity works, and this is how projectiles function in the common environment. Maybe that assumption is broken in outer space, or at very high speeds according to Einstein, or at very small scales according to quantum physics. But within the context that we are normally operating in, there is just a simple predictive rule that governs how projectiles fly. It's just a fact. And so these simple rules are things that if this understanding exists throughout time, and it seems like a lot of animals do understand the way that things fall towards the ground and stuff like that, and they don't want to jump off something that's too high. Like all of these things are understood by animals across time. This is a very this model of gravity and the basic kinematics. That's the word I was looking for, kinematics. This understanding, this inbuilt, innate intuition on kinematics is something that has endured. And that is certainly true. That is true. That model of predicting the world is true. And it is evidenced as being true as the fact that this has endured. And basically we know, just like we can just even think about it for 5 seconds and know that any animal that did not have an adequate understanding of kinematics in the way that it conducted itself, even if this is not a conscious understanding, but like an instinctual or implicit understanding of kinematics, if it's like bashing against walls at high speeds and like jumping off buildings or mountains or trees or whatever, and just not being robust enough to withstand the impact and just doing stupid stuff like that, going under rocks that are falling, and if it's doing these things, it's going to die. So we know that these models of understanding reality have endured, and that's why they're right. And so it's not clear that other things necessarily are as well substantiated as that when they're newer and on lesser timescales. For example, we may have had, some understanding of weapon manufacturing at some point, and it may have seemed to be correct, and there might have been some fallacies there. And if, let's say that there was a group of people who were unwilling to change their mind about this basic scientific concept about how to make better weapons, you can imagine them all getting killed in a war. when they needed to make better weapons. Maybe that's a bad example, but all that is to say is that there is this connection between models of the world that have endured the test of time and in truth. And actually what makes it true is the fact that it has lasted a really long time. The longer that idea has lasted, the longer that predictive model in your head that simulates the basic kinematics, the longer that has existed as a model for predicting the world means it's more true. And there might be like a philosophy of like always invest in Bitcoin. It always goes up. It never goes down. That's an interesting thing that's worked in the past 10 years. It's been a great investment strategy over the past 10 years, but is that going to work forever? Now, if we had thousands of years of history about and it kept going up and stuff, this would be a very interesting perspective, and I would lend a lot of credibility to. But it hasn't been around for very long. Now, people say it's true. People say you should invest in Bitcoin, you should continue investing in Bitcoin. There's interesting arguments to be made there, but to some extent, we shouldn't have that much confidence in such a new idea. It hasn't been around, and it hasn't stood a variety of different environments and circumstances and tail events. Like even if, let's say, your environment doesn't necessarily change, within your environment, there can be a variety of tail events that occur. And so like there could be you could be in some biome that remains the same, some ecosystem, and then there can still be a meteor that comes from outer space and crashes and kills everything. So over time, a bunch of possible cataclysms and tail events and black swan events will occur. And at that point, it will completely destroy anything that is not robust. And yet, through all of that, there is a basic understanding of kinematics that all the concepts that are evolutionary and all concepts are in a sense evolutionarily driven and are basically the amount of time that they have around actually is connected to how true they are in a very real sense. Let's keep
and out that name because the Darwinians only shot transforming through and mutation, essentially, and that there's nothing whatsoever that can surpass that. And so that brings me to the next point, if you don't mind, and then I'll shut up and let you talk. So I was thinking about that. I thought about that.
One more.
And there is no truth claim whatsoever that can surpass that. And so then that brings me to the next point, if you don't mind, and shut and let you talk. So I was thinking about that, and I thought about that for a long time. So it seems to me there's a fundamental contradiction between Darwin's claims and the Newton deterministic claim and the materialist objective claim that science is true in some final sense. And so I was thinking of two things that I read. One was the attempt by the KGB back in the late part of the 20th century to hybridize smallpox and Ebola and then aerosol it so it could be used on for mass destruction. And the thing is that that's a perfectly valid scientific enterprise as far as I'm concerned. It's an interesting problem. You might say, well, you shouldn't divorce it from the surrounding politics. Well, that's exactly the issue, is how much it can be divorced, and from what. And then the second example is, a scientist with any sense would say, well, our truths are incontrovertible. Let's look at the results. And we could say, well, let's look at the hydrogen bomb. If you want a piece of evidence that our theories about the subatomic structure of reality are accurate, you don't really have to look much farther than a hydrogen bomb. It's a pretty damn potent demonstration. And so then I was thinking, well, imagine for a moment that the invention of the hydrogen bomb did lead to the outcome, which we were also terrified about during the Cold War, which would have been, for the sake of argument, either the total elimination of human life or perhaps the total elimination of life. Now, the latter possibility is quite unlikely, but the former one certainly wasn't beyond comprehension. And so then I would say, well, the proposition that the universe is best conceptualized as subatomic particles was true enough to generate a hydrogen bomb, but it wasn't true enough to stop everyone from dying. And therefore, from a Darwinian perspective, it was a insufficient pragmatic proposition and was therefore, in some fundamental sense, wrong. And perhaps it was wrong because of what it left out. Maybe it's wrong in the Darwinian sense to reduce the complexity of being to a material substrate and forget about the surrounding context. So, well, those are two examples. And so you can have a way at that if you want.
Yeah, okay. So there.
Yeah, that's a really interesting edge case. I love that Jordan there was being provocative, saying, look at the, what basically, so there's this connection between the longevity of an idea and its truth. And I think that's a really solid point. And then he goes to this edge case and he's trying to provoke Sam, which he successfully does. And this just gets super autistic real quick. But, and then everything breaks down. But essentially, he's saying, okay, so now let's apply this to the hydrogen bomb. Now, clearly the hydrogen bomb in some level was accurate, but then that understanding led, if it had led to the extinction of all humans, in some sense that was inaccurate. And that does seem like a little bit of a challenging thing for Jordan's perspective. And like, especially because he's like, okay, so the reason why that is predictive is because it's, or why it's not true is maybe because it's like missing something, which I think that makes sense. But what doesn't make sense fully to me about what he's saying is that he's saying, oh, so maybe it's something along the lines of like, we're ignoring the context of like thinking about these nuclear weapons is ignoring some context about like the surroundings or something like that. I don't think that really works because it really depends on the scenario. So like, for example, if let's say you set off a bomb and then it set off a chain reaction that destroyed the whole world, that was something that some people were worried about at the time. It didn't happen. So that is a clear example of how that kind of a risk that wasn't accounted for. There was some truth to the model, but the model was ultimately not predictive, and therefore it was not fit. It was not, and therefore it was not true. It was literally inaccurate, and it led to something that we didn't predict to exist, and it also hurt our fitness. But then it's not like, the thing is like, let's imagine the scenario not where there was a chain reaction, but we used the hydrogen bomb and then everyone else used hydrogen bombs, and we just got into like this nuclear Armageddon, like snowball effect, where we just basically nuked ourselves out of existence. And this had more to do with human behavior and the dynamics of the way that the technology was used. And so then you start kind of exploring this idea a little bit deeper, and you start thinking, wait a second, okay, so how was this technology used? Like, so basically what you're saying is maybe there was some issue in the model with how we used it. Like maybe if someone says, making like the scientist inventing it, maybe they had a model in their mind about, I should have done this. I should have built this bomb because it's going to solve our problems. They were wrong. That was seems to be like the prediction that was wrong. They shouldn't have built the bomb. Nobody should have built the bomb. And the people who thought that they were using it and were going to get ahead actually ended up losing. To me, that shows more of a folly in those models rather than the folly in understanding the truth about nuclear weapons. So I think that is a bit of a problem. And I think that Sam Harris is going to push back on that quite a bit. And yeah, so